There are moments in live television when everything changes in an instant, when the carefully constructed world of polished professionalism suddenly cracks open, revealing something raw and real beneath the surface. This is the story of one such moment. This is what happened when a respected entertainer walked into a studio expecting a pleasant conversation and instead encountered something far more troubling, a complete abandonment of basic human decency. The day started like any other in the world of entertainment. A successful actor, someone known throughout his career for his incredible talent and dedication to his craft, had agreed to appear on a morning television program. He was there to discuss his latest film project, to share his enthusiasm with viewers, and to engage in the kind of friendly conversation that these interviews typically involved. He'd done this countless times before and saw no reason to expect anything different this time. When he arrived at the studio, he carried with him the warmth and professionalism that had defined his decades-long career. He greeted the host with genuine pleasantness, shook hands, and settled into the familiar chair across from her desk. The studio lights were bright, the audience was settled, and everything appeared ready for a standard morning chat show segment. But something in the air felt different. There was a tension that seemed to hang over the proceedings, an unusual sharpness in the atmosphere that our guest couldn't quite identify. The host began the interview with what appeared to be standard opening remarks. She welcomed him warmly enough, thanking him for coming, making small talk about his appearance and his career. But within moments, the tone began to shift. Instead of asking genuine questions about his work or allowing him to discuss his creative choices, the host launched into what could only be described as a series of personal attacks disguised as interview questions. The initial criticism came swiftly. When the guest mentioned that the script had resonated with him deeply, the host interrupted. She claimed she had watched the film and found it forgettable. She said this not as an opinion, but as if stating an objective fact, as if her personal reaction was somehow the definitive judgment on the entire work. The guest, being an experienced professional, initially responded with grace. He acknowledged that art is subjective and that different people connect with different stories. But the host would not accept this diplomatic response. Instead, she doubled down, moving from simple criticism of the film to broader attacks on the guest's career decisions. She suggested that his recent choices had been questionable. She implied that his last 3 projects had all been disappointing. She spoke with an aggressive posture and a tone that suggested she had decided in advance that this conversation would not be a pleasant exchange of ideas, but rather a confrontation. The guest remained composed, but his confusion was evident. This was not the typical morning television experience. This felt personal in a way that was inappropriate for the medium. He tried to steer the conversation back toward safer ground by explaining his approach to selecting roles. He mentioned that he chose projects based on the story, the character, and the creative team involved, not primarily on commercial success. The host's response was laughter, but it was the kind of laughter that cuts rather than connects. She suggested that perhaps it was time for the guest to be more realistic about the roles he was taking. And then she said something that crossed into truly uncomfortable territory. She referenced his age, implying that being older meant he should lower his expectations and be grateful for whatever roles came his way. This comment about age seemed to genuinely affect the guest. You could see it in his expression, the momentary flicker of hurt that crossed his face before he recovered his composure. He responded by noting that experience typically enhances an actor's craft rather than diminishing it. But the host pressed on relentlessly. She suggested he was simply taking whatever roles came his way these days, implying a desperate quality to his career that was simply not supported by facts. The guest began to realize that something more sinister was happening here. This was not an interview in any traditional sense. This was something designed to provoke, to upset, to create conflict for the sake of entertainment. He asked the host directly why the conversation had taken such a negative turn, suggesting that there was an important distinction between asking tough questions and launching personal attacks. The host responded by claiming to be simply doing her job, asserting that good journalism requires asking hard questions. The guest countered that there was indeed a difference between tough journalism and personal attacks, and he was beginning to wonder which category this conversation fell into. The tension in the studio became palpable. Crew members began exchanging worried glances. Producers in the control room were discussing whether to cut to a commercial break, but the compelling nature of the conflict kept the cameras rolling. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. As the interview continued, the host made it clear she intended to move from attacking the guest's career to attacking his personal life. She suggested that his fans would be interested in learning about the whole person, and she indicated that he had given people plenty to talk about over the years. She was being deliberately vague, but the implication was clear. She intended to delve into his private affairs and personal history. The guest responded firmly that he had come to discuss his work and that his personal life was not up for discussion. He attempted to establish a clear boundary, a line that any professional should respect. But the host crossed it immediately. She suggested that as a public figure, everything about him was fair game. She argued that this was simply the price of fame. The guest disagreed. He made an important distinction. Being a public figure does not make someone public property. There is a difference between having your work scrutinized and having your privacy invaded. A person, even a famous person, maintains the right to keep certain aspects of their life private and protected. But the host was undeterred. She had clearly decided that this interview would take a confrontational turn, and she was determined to push the guest into defending himself against accusations that hadn't even been explicitly stated. She began asking loaded questions about his personal relationships, about what she referred to as his dramatic relationships, asking whether his personal choices affected how audiences perceived his characters. The guest tried to maintain his dignity and professionalism. He suggested that audiences were intelligent enough to separate an actor from the roles he played. He said people didn't need tabloid gossip to enjoy a film. But with each response, the host became more aggressive. She insisted these weren't rumors but well-documented events, referencing his marriages and what she called his difficulties. The conversation had become increasingly hostile. The guest could feel it reaching a breaking point. He warned the host to be very careful about what she was implying. But instead of heeding this warning, the host seemed to be enjoying the confrontation. She appeared to be feeding off the discomfort she was creating. She suggested his life had been tumultuous, filled with drama and relationships that called his judgment into question. That comment was when the guest's professional mask finally slipped. He responded with controlled anger, asking if she really wanted to talk about judgment. He pointed out that she was engaging in character assassination disguised as journalism. He expressed his appallment that a broadcaster of her supposed reputation would stoop to such behavior. The control room descended into chaos. Producers were frantically trying to decide whether to cut the feed, but the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding kept the cameras rolling. This was becoming television history in real time. The host seemed unbothered by the guest's criticism. She laughed shrilly and suggested he was being dramatic. But when the guest stood up from his chair, it became clear that the situation had fundamentally changed. He was no longer willing to participate in what was happening. He addressed the host directly, saying that if this was her idea of a conversation, he couldn't imagine what she would call an interrogation. When the host commanded him to sit down, stating that they weren't finished, the guest responded with calm but absolute finality. He said they were indeed finished. He would not continue to be subjected to this treatment. He began to put on his jacket, signaling his intention to leave the interview. The host's response was desperate. She tried to assert her authority, claiming that you couldn't simply walk out of an interview, that she had a job to do. The guest responded by pointing out that her job was supposed to be interviewing people about their work, not launching personal attacks. He noted that his job certainly wasn't to sit and take abuse from someone who had clearly forgotten what professional journalism looked like. The host continued to protest, calling his reaction ridiculous and insisting her questions were perfectly legitimate. But the guest disagreed sharply. He told her there was nothing legitimate about anything she had done during this interview. He described her behavior as hostile, unprofessional, and frankly, cruel. The host's response was to rise from her own chair, her face contorted with anger, all pretense of professionalism completely dissolved. She demanded to know how he dared call her cruel, insisting she'd been in the business for years and knew how to do her job. But the guest remained eerily calm. He asked quietly whether she really did know, because from where he was standing, it looked as though she had forgotten everything about basic human decency. let alone professional broadcasting standards. For a moment, there was only silence in the studio, broken only by the sound of the host's heavy breathing. The tension was suffocating. Then the host made a comment that would become infamous. In what appeared to be a moment of utter loss of control, she made a reference to the guest's personal struggles with addiction. She made a crude comment suggesting that at least she showed up to work sober. The studio erupted in gasps. Producers in the control room were shouting. The guest, who had maintained his composure throughout this entire ordeal, went completely still. He stared at the host with an expression that combined shock, hurt, and disgust in equal measure. The guest's voice became deadly quiet as he asked if she had really just made a reference to his personal struggles with addiction on live television. The host seemed to finally realize she had gone too far. Her face went pale. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing any shred of remorse or basic human decency, she doubled down. She claimed she had simply said what everyone already knows. The guest's response was powerful. He explained that he had been sober for over 15 years. He had worked incredibly hard to overcome personal challenges and to build a successful career. What the host had just done was make the most disgusting and unprofessional comment he had ever heard on television. The host tried to interrupt and apologize, but the guest held up his hand and told her she had said quite enough. He said that she had revealed exactly who she was, and he believed her viewers deserved to know what kind of person they had been welcoming into their homes every morning. Then the guest did something remarkable. He turned to face the camera directly and spoke to the audience. He spoke with dignity and composure that stood in stark contrast to everything that had just occurred. He explained that he had come to discuss a film he was proud of, to share positive thoughts about creativity and storytelling. Instead, he said, he had been subjected to personal attacks and mockery of addiction recovery. He continued speaking directly to the viewers, making an important point about addiction and recovery. He explained that recovery from addiction is something millions of people struggle with every day. It is not a punchline. It is not ammunition for a talk show host who has run out of legitimate questions. It is a serious personal journey that deserves respect, not ridicule. The host protested weakly, saying he couldn't just give a speech to the camera and that this was her show. The guest turned back to her one final time, and his expression was one of such profound disappointment that it affected everyone in the room more deeply than anger ever could have. He pointed out that this wasn't a show anymore. It was a disgrace, and the host had turned what should have been a simple, pleasant conversation into something that would probably be remembered as one of the lowest moments in television history. The host snapped back that this was ridiculous, that he was being overly dramatic, but the guest calmly listed everything that had happened. In the space of 20 minutes, the host had attacked his career choices, questioned his judgment, invaded his privacy, and then made jokes about his recovery from addiction. He asked if that wasn't dramatic enough for her. The studio remained silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Everyone was holding their breath. The guest continued, saying that the viewers deserved better than this. They deserved a host who treated guests with basic human respect. They deserved someone who understood the difference between journalism and bullying. When the host objected to being called a bully, the guest asked what she would call what had just happened. What would she call attacking someone's personal life, their recovery, and their career? What would she call using someone's vulnerability as a weapon? The host had no answer. For the first time in the entire exchange, she was completely speechless. The guest picked up his jacket and looked at her one final time. He said softly that he hoped when she watched this back, she would see what everyone else had seen. He hoped she would understand why he couldn't stay any longer. The host said desperately that he couldn't just leave, that they had more to discuss. The guest responded with finality. They really didn't have anything more to discuss. He had made it clear he wasn't interested in discussing his work or anything constructive, and he wasn't interested in being her punching bag. Before leaving, the guest paused and looked back at the camera one more time. He addressed anyone watching who might be struggling with addiction or any other personal challenge. He spoke with warmth and sincerity. He told them that recovery is possible, that they deserve respect and support, and that their struggles do not define their worth as human beings. With that, the guest walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned silence and a television host whose true character had been exposed for all to see. The host remained standing behind her desk, her face showing a mixture of shock, anger, and perhaps the first glimmer of shame. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of her humiliation. She finally managed to say something about taking an early break, but the damage was already done. One cruel comment had destroyed her credibility and revealed the ugly truth about who she really was. The guest had walked away with his dignity intact. The host was left to face the consequences of her appalling behavior. What should have been a routine conversation about a new film had instead become a masterclass in how quickly a career can be damaged by cruelty, unprofessionalism, and the complete abandonment of basic human decency. And every devastating second had been captured on live television for the world to witness. This incident raises important questions about professionalism in media, about the responsibility that comes with having access to a platform, and about the basic human decency that should define all interactions, regardless of professional setting. It serves as a stark reminder that being a public figure does not grant anyone the right to be treated without respect, and that those who hold positions in media have a responsibility to use their platform ethically and with integrity. The contrast between the guest's behavior and the host's behavior became increasingly clear as the interview progressed. One person maintained dignity, professionalism, and composure even when facing escalating provocation. The other person abandoned every principle of journalism and basic human decency in pursuit of ratings and confrontation. In the end, this was not really about the film at all. It was about boundaries, respect, and the kind of person one chooses to be when given power over another person on live television.